The rain doesn't ask permission. It just falls, hard, cold, relentless, the way life always does when you're already running late. Katrina heard it before she felt it, a crack of thunder that shook the flower petals off her last unsold bouquet. She grabbed her yellow umbrella, shoved the shop door shut with her shoulder, and ran for the bus stop, until she stopped dead on the pavement. Because there was a man sitting in the rain. Not sheltering. Not running. Sitting. As if he had decided the storm no longer had the right to move him. We meet Katrina not at her best, but at her most real. Her hands smell like eucalyptus, and her coat has a fraying hem she has been meaning to fix for 3 months. She keeps her grandmother's florist shop alive on sheer stubbornness, and very little sleep. Tonight she missed dinner, she is 3 invoices behind, and the last bus home leaves in 4 minutes. The city around her is all wet concrete and orange halogen, the kind of gray that swallows small lives whole. But her umbrella is bright yellow. She bought it because it made her grandmother laugh. She has carried it ever since. The man on the bench is Charles. He is soaked through a dark leather jacket, his jaw set, his gaze fixed somewhere that isn't this street and isn't this city. He has the hands of someone used to being served and the posture of someone who has forgotten, just for tonight, what that feels like. He is not lost. He is hiding, and whatever he is hiding from just found him on every radio in the city. Katrina takes 4 steps past him. Then she stops, turns back, and tilts her yellow umbrella over his head without a single word of explanation. Katrina. Green knit sweater, apron still tied at her waist. Dark hair damp at the edges. Eyes that ask questions before her mouth does. She holds the umbrella the way she holds everything, like it matters more than it looks. Charles, Crown Prince Julian. Black leather coat soaked heavy. Groomed beard, aristocratic jaw. Turned away from her, watching the far end of the alley. He has the stillness of a man who has never had to run, and is only now learning what it costs to stay. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story has traveled. The rain doesn't ask permission. It just falls, hard, cold, relentless, the way life always does when you're already running late. Katrina heard it before she felt it, a crack of thunder that shook the unsold carnations on her closing table, that rattled the shop window like something trying to get in. She grabbed her yellow umbrella by instinct, killed the lights with her elbow, and shouldered the door shut behind her. 4 minutes. She had 4 minutes to cover 6 blocks, or she would be walking home in the kind of rain that doesn't distinguish between strangers and fools. Her heels hit the wet cobblestones in a rhythm she didn't choose, urgent, syncopated, the sound of someone who hasn't stopped moving since 5 in the morning. The street was empty the way streets get at this hour, a lone taxi cutting through a puddle, its headlights dragging twin gold lines down the road, a shuttered bakery breathing the ghost of bread into the cold. The bus stop was ahead. She could see it. She was going to make it. Then she saw him. He was sitting on a bench at the edge of the small park she always cut through, the one with the iron fence and the old plane tree that still had its autumn leaves. He wasn't huddled. Wasn't running, wasn't cursing the weather, wasn't doing any of the reasonable things people do when the sky breaks open over their heads. He was just sitting, shoulders squared, jaw set, rain pouring off the collar of a dark leather jacket, as if he had simply decided the storm no longer had jurisdiction over him. Katrina stopped. Her heels went silent. In the distance, she heard the low diesel growl of her bus pulling up to the stop. She heard it. She knew exactly what it was. She looked at the bus. She looked at the man. She looked at the bus again. She crossed the wet grass. She didn't say anything at first. She just raised the umbrella over his head. The sound changed immediately. Rain on canopy instead of rain on leather, a softer, more forgiving percussion. He didn't flinch. Didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the far end of the street, somewhere past the amber glow of the nearest lamppost, somewhere she couldn't follow. You don't have to do that, he said. His voice was low and even, like a man who had spent years learning to keep it that way. There was an accent in it she couldn't immediately place, something underneath the careful flatness of it, something old and deliberate, like architecture that had been renovated but not entirely disguised. I know, she said. A pause. The rain held steady. The bus, somewhere behind her now, exhaled its doors shut and moved on without her. You miss your bus. I did. Because of me. Technically because of you, she agreed, but really because of me. I'm the one who stopped. He turned then, slowly, as if the motion cost him something. She got her first proper look at him, dark eyes, a groomed beard running to scruff at the edges, a face that had probably been described, at some point, as distinguished. But what struck her was not the sharpness of his features, it was the exhaustion underneath them. Not the tiredness of a man who needed sleep. The tiredness of a man who needed to put something down, and hadn't found anywhere to set it yet. He looked at her umbrella. He looked at her face. He said flatly, carefully, the voice of someone assembling a sentence the way you disarm something. What do you want for this? Katrina blinked. It's an umbrella. Not a transaction. Everything is a transaction. That's a miserable way to live, she said pleasantly, and held the umbrella a little steadier. Come on. My shop is 3 blocks. You can dry off and call someone. He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was running behind those dark, exhausted eyes, she couldn't read it. Then he stood, and he was taller than she expected, the kind of tall that reorganizes a space around it. He fell into step beside her without another word, as if the decision had been made somewhere in the body before the mind could object. They walked without much conversation, which suited them both. The rain gave them something to move through together, a shared condition that required no explanation. She tilted the umbrella slightly toward him. He was taller, and she was practical, which meant the right side of her shoulder got wet. She didn't mention this. He noticed anyway. You're getting rained on. Marginally. We could walk closer. She considered this. We could. She didn't move. He didn't move. They continued as they were, exactly 1 careful foot of distance between them, and she found herself oddly grateful for that distance, not because she was afraid, but because it felt like a form of respect. 2 strangers being honest about being strangers. She noticed his shoes first. They were good shoes, or had been. The leather was soaked and beginning to crease, but the construction was unmistakable. Hand-welted, she would guess, the kind that cost more than her weekly grocery budget without the buyer giving it a second thought. She had learned to read small luxuries. Flowers teach you that. People buy carnations when money is tight and orchids when they want to pretend it isn't, and somewhere in the middle is the truth of what they can actually afford. His hands were in his jacket pockets, but when he reached across to steady the umbrella pole for a moment, a gust of wind had tried to take it. She caught a glimpse. Long fingers. Clean nails. A faint, fading mark on the left wrist, like something worn there regularly that wasn't there tonight. A watch. An expensive one, she imagined. Or something else. She looked at her own hands wrapped around the umbrella handle. The calluses at the base of her fingers where she held pruning shears. The small white scar where a thorn had gone too deep 2 Februaries ago. Hands that told on her immediately. Told everything about the work they did, the care they carried, the life they served without complaint. You work with your hands, he said. She glanced at him sideways. Florist. Ah. He seemed to turn this over. The shop we're going to. The same. You were closing late. I'm always closing late. She paused. Were you waiting for someone? At the park. No. The word came out with a quiet finality that told her it was true, and also that it was the end of that particular road. She didn't push. She had a rule about pushing. She'd learned it from her grandmother, who said that the best way to make someone shut a door was to walk through it without being invited. They came without sirens. That was the first thing that struck her, how quiet it was, for all that it was. 3 black vehicles, long and low and entirely without the self-consciousness of ordinary cars, moving in a loose formation that blocked both ends of the street before Katrina had fully understood what she was seeing. Their headlights were surgical. They didn't sweep or search. They simply arrived, certain of where they needed to be, the way consequence always is. The shop door opened before anyone knocked. Katrina was on her feet without deciding to stand. The man who entered first was not in uniform, which was somehow worse than if he had been. He wore a dark suit that fit the way a second skin fits, and his eyes moved across the shop in a single, efficient arc, taking inventory, assigning threat levels, filing everything away before his shoes had fully cleared the threshold. Behind him, 2 more. Same suits. Same eyes. The kind of men who had learned to make themselves feel inevitable. They looked past her. The one in front, older, silver at the temples, the careful stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to project authority without raising his voice, fixed his gaze on Charles and said, with an inflection that bent the word into something between relief and reproach, "Your Royal Highness." The room went very still. Katrina heard the words. She heard them land. She watched Charles, who had been sitting on the stool with a blanket around his shoulders drinking tea from a mismatched mug, straighten in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with identity. It happened in less than a second, the shoulders, the jaw, the hands, the eyes. The man who had laughed at her heater 3 minutes ago receded like a tide going out, and what was left in his place was older, and more careful, and wore its authority the way old stone wears weather, inseparably. She thought, distantly and absurdly, of the coins in her purse. She had handled his face 1,000 times without knowing it. Had pressed it between her fingers counting change, had set it on counters, had dropped it into tip jars. His face. The face of the man currently sitting in her grandmother's shop wrapped in a blanket she had bought at a closing down sale 3 winters ago. The head of security's name, she would later learn, was Harmon. He did not offer it tonight. Tonight he looked at Katrina the way a customs officer looks at an undeclared item, not with hostility, exactly, but with a professional assumption of guilt pending evidence to the contrary. "Ma'am." His voice was flat. Controlled. "How long has His Royal Highness been on these premises?" Katrina looked at him. Then at Charles. Charles was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something careful and alert, the look of a man who had just realized that someone else was about to pay a cost he had incurred. "About an hour," she said. "And your relationship to His Royal Highness? We've never met before tonight." "You expect me to believe," Harmon said, with the measured patience of a man who did not believe most things he was told, "that you approached a stranger in the street, brought him to your private premises, and kept him here for an hour without knowing who he was. He was sitting in the rain," she said. "He needed somewhere dry. Without knowing anything about him, yes." She kept her voice even. She had dealt with difficult customers before. People who returned flowers they'd killed through neglect and wanted a refund for it, and the technique was the same: stay calm, stay factual, don't give them anything to push against. "I'm a florist. I gave him tea and a blanket. That is the entirety of what happened here." Harmon's eyes moved around the shop again. The 2 mugs. The blanket. Her wet coat on the hook. The yellow umbrella, drying, propped against the door frame. He was building a picture, and she could see from his expression that the picture kept coming out less sinister than he wanted it to. "We'll need your details," he said. "Full name, address, identification." "That's enough." The voice was Charles's. It was not loud. It was not even particularly sharp. But it had a quality she had not heard in it before, a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the chest, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing that when he spoke, the room would reorganize itself around the words. Not because he demanded it. Because it was simply true. Harmon stopped. Charles set down his mug on the counter with a quiet, final sound. He stood, and the blanket slipped from his shoulders to the stool, and he was again the man she'd seen for a fraction of a second out there on the street. The man underneath the stranger, the one she'd sensed rather than seen. This woman shared her umbrella, he said still quietly. She offered shelter to someone who appeared to need it. She asked nothing in return, accepted no compensation, and told me nothing about myself I didn't already know. He paused. She is not a suspect. She is not a witness. She is someone to whom I owe a considerable debt, and you will treat her accordingly. Harmon held the pause for exactly as long as professional dignity required. Then, yes, sir. The word sir landed differently than the earlier Your Royal Highness had. More weight in it. More reality. Katrina said nothing. She was looking at Charles, and he was looking at her, and in the space between them was everything that had been said in the last hour and also the thing that hadn't been said, the thing that couldn't be now, with 3 men in dark suits absorbing the air from her grandmother's shop. His expression was not apologetic. She appreciated that. An apology would have made it smaller. Instead, it was something she had no good word for. Regret, maybe, but not the kind that asks forgiveness. The kind that simply acknowledges, this is what is, and I wish it were otherwise, and that wishing changes nothing. The leaving happened too quickly. That was the thing about power, she thought. It moved at its own pace, and the people attached to it had to move with it whether or not they were finished with where they were. Harmon spoke quietly into an earpiece. One of the other 2 men stepped outside. The remaining one positioned himself near the door with the particular practiced neutrality of someone whose job was to be present without being a person. Charles picked up his jacket from the stool. He didn't put it on. It was still soaked, just held it, and she thought that was probably a metaphor for something, but she was too tired to assemble it. He crossed to the door. Stopped. He looked at the yellow umbrella. Take it, she said. Katrina. It's still raining, she said. Take it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the umbrella. He held it with both hands for a second, lightly, the way you hold something you understand the weight of, and she thought she saw something move across his face that the composed exterior almost but not quite contained. I didn't lie to you, he said. About any of it. I know, she said. And she did. That was the thing she'd keep coming back to, later, in the quiet of the shop after the black cars were gone. The wire in the tree, the room with no air in it, the desire to disappear just once, none of that had been performance. All of it had been true. The name had been the only misdirection, and even that was only a half-lie. Charles was in there somewhere, underneath everything else he was required to be. He nodded once. Then he walked out, and the man by the door followed, and the black cars outside absorbed him in the quiet, efficient way they had absorbed everything else about the night. Katrina stood in the doorway of her shop and watched them go. The rain was still coming down, steady, unhurried, entirely unimpressed by the spectacle it had just witnessed. The last car in the convoy turned at the far end of the street and disappeared, and the lamppost light hit the wet cobblestones alone again the way it always had, the way it would tomorrow and the day after. She was standing in the rain now, she realized. She had given away her umbrella. She stood there for another moment anyway, her hair flattening against her forehead, her coat somewhere inside. There was something right about it, she thought, about being rained on, at the end of this particular night. Something that felt less like misfortune and more like punctuation. Then she went back inside and washed the 2 mugs. She left the blanket folded on the stool. She turned off the heater, which gave one last indignant rattle before going quiet. She locked the shop door, turned up her collar, and walked home through the rain without running, arriving late and entirely soaked and somehow, in a way she couldn't account for, not unhappy. The man arrived at 10 the following morning. He was not in a dark suit this time. He wore a pale gray one, the kind that announces itself as expensive by refusing to announce itself at all. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and had the practiced, pleasant expression of someone who delivered difficult things for a living and had made his peace with it. Katrina was repotting a fern when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up. She recognized the type immediately, if not the face. "Miss Katrina?" He set the portfolio on the counter with quiet authority. "I represent the office of the royal household." He opened it. Inside, a document, several pages, dense with the kind of language that had been engineered to be simultaneously polite and inescapable. And beneath it, a cheque. She didn't look at the number. She looked at his face instead. He had the professionally neutral expression of a man who expected this to take about 10 minutes. "It's a standard discretion agreement," he said, sliding it toward her. "A acknowledgement that the events of last evening were a private matter, not intended for public dissemination. In recognition of any inconvenience caused," he gestured at the cheque, "the household offers this as a goodwill gesture. No obligation, of course." "Of course," she said. She looked at the document. She looked at the cheque. She read the first paragraph of the document, which used 12 words where 2 would have done and managed, in 12 words, to transform the previous night into a liability to be managed. She thought about Charles saying everything is a transaction, and herself saying that's a miserable way to live. She picked up the cheque first. She tore it in half, then in half again, and set the 4 pieces on the counter in a neat small pile. The envoy's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He had not expected that. Most people, she imagined, did not do that. She pushed the document back across the counter. "I'm not going to sign that. Miss Katrina, I want to assure you that the terms are entirely—" "I'm sure they are," she said pleasantly. "I'm still not going to sign it. The household simply wants to ensure." "What happened last night," she said, "was that a man sat in the rain and I gave him an umbrella. That's all it was. I don't need to be paid to keep quiet about it, and I don't need to sign anything to stay decent." She looked at him steadily. "I would have done it for anyone. I would do it again tomorrow for someone else. That's not a secret. That's just who I am." A pause. The envoy looked at the 4 pieces of cheque. He looked at her. He closed the portfolio. He said, with what she thought might have been a fraction of genuine respect breaking through the professional veneer, "I'll convey your position to the household." "Please do," she said. And then, because she was still her grandmother's granddaughter, "Would you like a flower for your buttonhole? I have some very nice freesias. No charge." He left with a pale yellow freesia in his lapel and the document and signed in his portfolio. Katrina swept the torn cheque into the bin and went back to her fern. 3 weeks passed. The city went on doing what cities do, accumulating weather and noise and the small daily dramas of people trying to keep their lives from coming apart at the seams. Katrina fixed the fraying hem of her coat. She sorted the seed catalogs. She lost the Tuesday to a burst pipe under the sink and gained it back on a Saturday when a last-minute wedding order came in that paid well enough to cover February's shortfall. She thought about Charles sometimes. Not in the way she would have if the story had been a different kind of story, not with longing or romance, not constructing imaginary continuations. She thought about him the way you think about a piece of music you heard once through an open window, that you'll never hear again in quite that arrangement. Not with grief, but with a kind of gratitude for having been in the right place at the right moment to catch it. She thought about what he'd said about the wire and the tree. She hoped he'd found somewhere to set the weight down, even briefly. She suspected he hadn't. She thought that was probably the saddest thing about being what he was, not the absence of freedom, exactly, but the way freedom had to be stolen in increments, one rainy night at a time. And even then it came for you in the end. The letter about the redevelopment had been sitting in her drawer for 6 weeks. She had read it so many times she could recite the relevant paragraph, the building and its neighboring properties had been identified for acquisition as part of the city's strategic infrastructure expansion, and while the council recognized the historical significance of the affected businesses, the public interest imperative was considered to outweigh. She always stopped reading there. The rest was just the machinery of it, the gears and levers that moved things whether or not anyone wanted them moved. She had made inquiries, attended a council meeting, written a letter that she suspected had been filed immediately in the category of correspondence that looked like concern but functioned as theater. She had not given up. Giving up was not in her vocabulary, nor had it been in her grandmother's, but she had begun, very quietly, to think about what afterwards might look like. Whether the feeling of the shop could survive a different address. Whether the photographs would mean the same thing on different walls. The morning the envelope arrived, she almost missed it. It was a Tuesday, and she was late opening because she'd been to the market, and the market had been crowded, and her trolley had a wheel that pulled left. She came in carrying 3 buckets of tulips and a bag of florist wire and had to set everything down to get her keys, and the envelope was on the floor just inside the door where it had been slipped through the letterbox, and she nearly stood on it. It was heavy. The paper had a texture she had never felt before in an envelope, firm and slightly warm, the kind of paper that knew what it was. And across the back, pressed and waxed a deep, specific red of something official and old, was a seal. She turned it over. Her name on the front, written by hand in ink that had dried to the color of old amber. The handwriting was careful and clear, and she recognized it immediately, though she had never seen it before, the way you sometimes recognize a voice you've only heard once. She set the tulips down in the sink. She made tea. She sat on the stool, the same stool, and she opened the envelope. There were 2 items inside. The first was a single sheet of the same heavy paper, and on it, in the same handwriting, "I am told you tore up the cheque. I am not surprised. I am told you refused to sign the agreement. I am not surprised by that either. I am sorry it was sent. It was not my instruction, and it did not represent what I wished to convey, which is only this, that an hour under a yellow umbrella reminded me what it feels like to be simply a person in the company of another person, without the weight of everything else that is usually attached. I have not forgotten it. I don't expect I will. See." She read it twice. Then she set it carefully on the counter and picked up the second item. It was an invitation. Gold-edged, formally printed, bearing the crest she now recognized from coins and courtyard gates and the tops of official letters. It informed Miss Katrina, in the gracious but unambiguous language of royal correspondence, that Petals and Porch had been appointed the sole floral provider to the palace for the coming season, commencing with the decoration of the Royal Spring Gala, and that this appointment had been made by personal direction of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and carried, accordingly, the full authority of the household. Below the formal text, in the same careful handwriting, a single added line. The brief in the enclosed document asks for something that feels like the inside of a good place. I suspect you know what that means. She did know. She thought of chrysanthemums in a rain-lit window. Trailing ivy over the cooler shelf. The particular smell of earth and green and something sweet underneath. The smell that had made a man pause in a doorway and breathe as if he'd almost forgotten how. Katrina sat for a long time on the stool. Outside, the city went about its business. A pigeon landed on the windowsill and regarded her with the profound indifference of pigeons everywhere. The fern she'd repotted 3 weeks ago had put out a new frond, small and tightly curled, testing the air. Then she stood up. She tied on her apron. She picked up the invitation and tucked it behind her grandmother's photograph, the one from Chelsea, 1994, with the ribbon and the grin, where it sat like a footnote to everything the woman in the photograph had always believed about the way small acts move through the world, quietly and without announcement, arriving somewhere larger than where they started. She filled the sink with the tulips. Red gold, the palest possible cream. She began to trim the stems, the clean, familiar sound of it, the work her hands knew before her mind caught up, and she thought about what it would mean to fill a palace with the feeling of a place that had never been grand and had never needed to be. What it would mean to carry her grandmother's shop into rooms that had never known it, and leave some of its particular warmth in the air. Outside, the city was bright this morning, one of those cold, clarified winter days when the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look recently arrived. No rain. The cobblestones dry for the first time in what felt like weeks. Somewhere a bus went past, its engine rising and falling as it moved through the gears, and she thought, there will be another one. There always is. She trimmed the last stem. She put the tulips in water. She turned the sign on the door from closed to open, and the morning came in. Heartsuit, subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story has traveled.